just to show some examples in here. And basically, the main thing that we're going to look at today is the 5 different transaction types that you could enter against a project so that you're going to have those P&L reports fill out accurately. So the first one is time entries. So we're going to use the Today Creative for accuracy there. Some people might just do time entries through the timesheet, which is fine, but we'd like to be able to show on those P&L reports that folks put the actual time for the actual services that we budgeted for, which, as everyone knows, a budget in Workamajig is an approved estimate on a project. So we want to make sure that there's accuracy there, and we'll walk through that. Also, some folks don't have hourly costs entered in their employee records, and that's going to cut down on your accuracy. You're going to see just 0 in that column when you're looking at the reports for client P&L and on project P&Ls. So I'll be showing you in the employee record where you can update that. There's always a lot of concern about that because that does include a salary. Usually that's a fully loaded number with the salary and benefits. But I also pulled up and navigated to a helpful support page on that called How to Hide Employees' Hourly Cost and Labor at Net. So this is I won't cover this document other than to say we can help you step by step, make sure that anywhere in the system, any report, we can keep people out of that. So you people feel a little bit more comfortable with populating that information in Workamajig. We can make sure no one can get to it unless they are meant to. And then as far as the other transactions, expense reports. Now, when we say expense reports in Workamajig, we're really referring to something where you're going to reimburse a user. So they're not using a corporate card. They're using either cash out of pocket. Maybe they went to visit a client and they had to pay a parking fee, something like that. And they had to use either their own personal credit card or cash. And so that would be categorized as an expense report. And we're going to look at that. Also, miscellaneous costs, which in Workamajig, what we mean when we say miscellaneous costs is any cost that you incur, and then you need to parse it out to the different projects. So an example of that might be a large purchase of stock photography. Even if you purchased it 5 years ago, you need to parse out a cost for that. And so you don't really have a vendor invoice to enter. There's no credit card charge to attach. It's just an overhead expense that we incurred that now we're trying to cost out to the different projects. So that would be a miscellaneous cost. I'll be showing you where to enter those. And then, of course, vendor invoices. So any vendor invoice, some of the trickier things on that is sometimes folks will add the project number to the header and not the line. So we'll be showing you some pitfalls to watch out for to make sure that transaction is hitting the project. That's the important thing for this call. And then last but not least, credit card charges, and whether you bring them over, through the Plaid connection. And if you're not familiar with that, definitely ask your account manager about that one. That's a big time saver. Or whether you're importing them through a download that you got from your credit card company or the bank, or whether you're just entering them. Some people have so few credit card charges, they just enter them one off in Workamajig one by one. So we're just going to show you where the project number needs to be populated there so that that feeds through to make sure that the reporting is accurate as far as profitability on the project. So those are the 5 types of transactions: time entries, expense reports, miscellaneous costs, vendor invoices, and credit card charges that would affect the project P&L. And we want to make sure that we teach you in this session how to apply those accurately. Then, of course, we'll look at the project P&L reports and also at the client P&L reports and show you how you can drill down on those, how you can customize those a little bit. But as far as like training on those, we have some nice documentation in the help guide, of course, which if you search for any report, not just these 2 that we're talking about today, the project and the client profit and loss, you see a lot of great information, how it works, how we are calculating different profit columns that you're adding and that sort of thing. And then I'll also be showing you how you can modify those reports. So let's get started. I have a test project set up here that we're going to use, and it's under my recent. So I'm just using this little shortcut here to get to that project that I was working with before our call. So here's the project that we're going to use today. And I went ahead, and if you go to the transaction section of this project, I went ahead and added a transaction for every type that we're going to be talking about today. So I could have searched here in your search criteria if I just wanted to see a particular date range, or if I just wanted to see a labor transaction, like a time entry, I can search for that. But there's no search filters in this. We're just searching for all. So you're seeing all the different categories here. So this particular project has a credit card charge on here. It has an expense report. It has some time entries, which are labor. It has a miscellaneous cost and an order. So that would be if you're doing like insertion orders or purchase orders, it has that as well. And then a couple of vendor invoices. Looks like they're pretty old, so I added a new one. So you're looking at those transactions. This is where you would see them, but let's show you where they would be entered. So how did they get on this project? So the first thing that we want to look at is miscellaneous costs, because that's right here at the project level that's entered. And essentially, if you have one already, you're going to see a blue insert row, and then you're going to add the item. So I mentioned stock photography earlier because that's such a common one, but I don't have stock photography as an item here. Most of you probably do, but really any of your purchase items that, again, you incurred as an overhead expense, and now you're ready to say, okay, well, I don't have a vendor invoice to enter anymore, but I need to get this cost onto this project. And you also have the option to add a markup. So, if you just are entering if you want everything to kind of flow together and add out so that you can run a report and say, well, how many vendor invoices did I enter? Dollar amount for stock photography, that was 1,000. Let me make sure that I've at least costed $1,000 to all my projects. Then you want to make sure you're picking the same item when you enter the vendor invoice and when you enter it as a miscellaneous cost. So we're not going to show that reporting today, but definitely get with your account manager if you want some custom reports created, then you need that kind of thing. But just as a cautionary tale, you want to make sure you're always picking the same item. It kind of goes along the same lines as when I create a budget, an approved estimate for particular services. When folks do their time entries of their actuals, we want them picking those same services. So I'm going to show you that in just one moment here on the Today Creative page. So I'm just going to pick an item here. Supplies is always a good one. And then I have department enabled. That might not be something that you have on your account. So it is required for me, probably is not for you. And then I'm going to add, maybe I need a particular quantity of something and I want Workamajig to do the math to figure that out and bring it to 300. And then I can also manually add the markup. In Workamajig, there's so many different places where you can add the markup. You can add it at the item level, so it would have come through here automatically. You can add it at like the client level where you say, hey, no matter what the item that's purchased, the markup is 40% or whatever the case may be. Again, this training isn't really going to cover that, but just as a side note, you can get with your account manager if you'd like to automate some of that. Of course, a lot of people really like just being able to add it manually at the time because they want that flexibility. So either way is totally fine. So I've added another miscellaneous cost. So now there's two miscellaneous costs here. There's no approval process or anything for that like there is with a vendor invoice or time entries. It's just entered directly. And again, at some point in time long ago, I had made a purchase, overhead purchase, and now I'm just allocating it to this project in particular. So that's miscellaneous costs. So let's look at time entries. I do have a time entry. In fact, let me just show you that really quick here. It's already open. Now I'm opening it again. It's going to be open twice. I'll close one of those. So on the schedule, you can see that I'm going to be assigned to this task of concept creative development. Those are my initials, MC there, Marlene. And if I would drill into that, I'd be able to see that I'm allocated hours there. And so when I see that work on my Today Creative page, so I'm just going to navigate the Today Creative where folks are looking at what they're assigned and what work they're going to do. I'm going to see that assignment here. And this is really the most ideal way to enter time, because when you enter time this way, you're going to be able to see, and I'm just clicking on this little clock icon to, whoops, and it's what I meant to click on, but you got to be a little careful there. If you click a little above it, then you're entering or you're opening the task. So I'm going to say new time entry, and you're going to see that everything is populated for me as far as these required fields, except for the number of hours I worked. So that we don't know. You have to tell us how many hours you worked, but I need to know that it's the right project. I need to know that they're picking the right task. That way, when I look at budgets by task, that's accurate. And then I need, most importantly, to know that they're hitting the right service. A lot of us have different pricing for the different services, and you might even have levels within something like copywriting, like senior copywriting or junior copywriting. So it's really imperative, if we're getting the correct costs, which is what this webinar is all about, accurate P&Ls. If we're getting that to be accurate, we don't want people just picking and guessing. We want it to come from the assignment ideally, because then everything is going to tie together, especially if you create your estimate in Workamajig by pulling from your project schedule. That's really the Workamajig way, is when you're have a bunch of estimated hours in your project schedule for your tasks, and you've picked the service that you want and it's associated with a dollar amount. If we use the pull from schedule feature with that, then to create our budget, which is the approved estimate, everything is going to match up. So, and then we're going to be able to see the actuals compared against a more accurate budget. So I'm just going to put 10 hours in here. I worked really hard today on that task, and I'm going to say it's done to remove it from my list, and I'm going to say save. And it says open to-dos. That's okay. We're not training on to-dos today, so we'll say yes. That is a nice little reminder, though. If you are using the to-do feature, the system will ask you, did you really want to close that? Because you have some open to-dos, which if you're not familiar with those, your account manager can give you a training on that. That's really just a way to add some detail or flesh out a task so that there's a little bit more for folks to check off. But as you can see, I could just override that and not check it off. So we have our time entry there. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is expense reports, and that is under your everyone dot here. And so if I'm going to start a new expense report, I have the blue plus icon. There's a few different places within the system where I could start a new expense report. Really anything new in the system, you can hit your plus, your main plus up here, and start anything new, including a new expense report. But I wanted to navigate to the expense report area in case folks aren't familiar with that. If you don't see an option for expense reports, everything in Workamajig is driven by your security rights. So maybe you don't normally do expense reports and your administrator has chosen not to have you have to look at that as an option. So don't worry if you don't have it and you don't normally do expense reports. It doesn't mean there's any problem. It just means that your administrator has not added that for you. And it's going to look very same to that miscellaneous cost that we entered, where I'm picking an item. I'll pick supplies again because I know that's in here. And then I can do the same thing where if I want to do a quantity or if I just want to go straight to the amount, I can do that, and then it'll calculate the gross. And maybe this one doesn't have a markup, so I'll leave that blank for this particular item. If this is something that's going to the project, though, the most important thing here is that once this expense report gets converted to a vendor invoice, that the project is on there. And the best way to do that is really just add the project right now. So even though it's not a required field, I'm going to go ahead and add that project. I'll have another opportunity when I convert this to a vendor invoice, but usually if you're filling out the expense report, you know which project you were purchasing something for. Now, if this is just like, I mentioned earlier, like if you go to visit, it's a client visit and a $10 parking fee you came out of pocket, well, you need to be reimbursed for that. So you're filling out an expense report for that reason. Then the question becomes, well, we have 4 or 5 projects going with this client right now. Which one should I select? And that's where I wanted to kind of talk about an option. And it's not just for expense reports, but this is a good time to talk about it. If you have a lot of overhead for a particular client and you don't want to attach it to a particular project because you want to measure the project profit and loss for each one of those deliverables on the project. If you're creating a new website, you want to see the project profit and loss for the website only. If you're creating a new brochure that client is going to use to hand out to their clients, well, you want to see the profit and loss separately from that. So if you have a lot of overhead expenses, then you might want to actually create an overhead project for that client. And that way you're still getting accuracy when you run a client P&L, because you're saying, oh, this particular project is where I'm going to park all of the overhead expenses. A lot of people will put even like if they're bidding new business or anything. So time entries, not just expense reports, time entries could apply there. If you send the client a big giant bouquet of flowers as a thank you gift, well, you're not going to want to cost that to a particular project, but you might want to cost that to, the profitability of the client overall. So that's where you could have an overhead project in there. And if you have any questions about that, whether that's right for you or whether that's meaningful, then of course you can meet and talk with your account manager about that. So I'm going to pause just for a second because some folks were saying, I'm seeing your main screen. I think that's old though. So hopefully Cindy can see that we've moved around now. And then someone asked if there's a way to make a miscellaneous cost show as a cost of goods sold. Not really. I'll show you whenever we run the report that you can pull out miscellaneous costs as its own column and see that. But if you really want it to be a COGS, then you would have to, you can enter, if you do have an overhead charge, something like, I'm going to go back to my stock photography example. You don't have to just put that in as overhead. If you want to outline, like say, at the time you purchase something like that, and I'll be showing you this next when we look at the vendor invoices, but you can add multiple projects within one vendor invoice and have it post or point to the different projects that are needed. So that'll make a little bit more sense here in a bit when I add the vendor invoice for us. And then of course, Cindy says, and you can assign a COGS account to a miscellaneous cost. So that's more along the accounting realm of things. And she makes a good point there, but we're not going to cover that today. So if you do have questions about that, you can talk with your account manager, but that's really there's workarounds for everything. We'll just say that. We all know that if we're in the accounting realm. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just convert this. I'm going to approve it. It says submit, but let me see if I can just approve it. I actually didn't think of that. Well, I'm probably maybe my own expense report approver. Hold please. We're going to jump into the employee record here and make sure that I'm my own expense account approver. Probably I am. One might think, oh, I don't even have one. Well, no wonder it says submit. So I'm going to make myself my expense account approver, and that way we can keep going with our process and actually show the expense report. And which one was it? I think it was this one. Yes, today's date. And mine says 7/3 because it's showing Canadian presentation of the date. So I'm going to hit approve. Notice it changed from submit to approve. And now that I have an approved vendor invoice, I get a new dot, create my vendor invoice. So when I create that vendor invoice, now we're going to talk about vendor invoices and how you could have multiple projects on the line. Now, whatever I've entered in the previous screen, and even if you're just, jumping into creating a new vendor invoice from the main menu here and creating a new vendor invoice here, you don't have to only have one project. So when you go to create a new vendor invoice, you'll see a field that says project. And you might say, but I have multiple projects that this needs to adhere to. This is the header project. So it's convenient if everything is for one project on that vendor invoice to enter it here, because then it automatically enters it on the line here. But really, even if you left this blank, the more important thing for getting the cost accurately assigned to the project is that there's a project on the line. So I'll see sometimes where someone says, oh, I forgot to put a project, and maybe they already have entered all their lines, and they say, oh, let me go ahead and rectify that and enter the project here. That won't help you out, unfortunately. Once you already have the lines here, you would really need to go in and populate that project field on every line. And I would say that's probably the number one thing that people ask that are, maybe a new user in the account is, hey, I don't see my transactions and I put the project number and I'm looking at the profitability and none of these transactions are showing. And I'll many times find that they added the project number after they entered the lines. because that doesn't do you any good. So you definitely, if you know it ahead of time and all the projects are the same for that vendor invoice, then absolutely enter it when you know it, and it'll populate it automatically on the line. But if you don't, then when you're entering these, you have to enter the different project numbers. So I'm just going to randomly pick another project number so that you can see that you can enter more than one. Of course, I didn't put an item, and that is required. I love how Workamajig reminds me. I appreciate that. And that's because you technically could, even if it was the same invoice and I have department, you probably don't have this. And I also have GL accounts set up. So let's just throw that in there so we have something. Nice thing, you can't hardly go wrong with Workamajig because it'll yell at you and give you a red banner message and tell you need to correct that. But this is definitely showing it, pointing to two different projects. So important that if you are entering one vendor invoice and it needs to be spread out, that you're entering those on the line. All right, so we're going to navigate away from here. That was really just to make the point that the line is where the project number needs to be. Now, so we've talked about time entries, we talked about expense reports, and then that goes into the vendor invoice because this particular expense report we were going to pay. But there are times when you pay your expense reports through payroll. So if you do that, then you might say, well, I really don't need a vendor invoice in here because I'm not going to cut a check to my person. So you can actually just mark vendor invoices as paid. You don't have to actually go through that process, but that's when it becomes more important than ever that you have that project number in the expense report itself, because it's not going to flow through and create a vendor invoice where you can put the project number. It has to be on there when you're going to just mark them as paid if you do it through payroll, which is common. And then, of course, last but not least, we have our credit card charges, and lots of different things to say about credit card charges, but we're not training on those today. But if you have questions, and I touched on something like mentioning Plaid, and you say, wow, we don't do that today, but we really would like to learn more about it and do that, definitely reach out. We kind of expect an increased number of people emailing us after these webinars with different types of questions when they just hear like, oh, I heard some information I'm interested in, and I want to follow up on that. All right, and then I also want to go back to our questions really quick here too. And then it says, can you make project number mandatory on the expense report? What a great question, Cindy. Cindy's my client and has great questions. You cannot, and that's because they could be used for overhead. So, if you went out and bought donuts for the office, well, we don't want to force you to have an overhead project to point that transaction to, but that is really, and to be honest with you, I should look that up and get back to you, because we are always, every month we add something new into Workamajig, and that is not the first time that's been asked. Can we require a project number for that? So that may be something that either is coming in the future, or maybe it's even here, and my account wouldn't have all the new transactions that have come down the pipe, and I don't activate everything. So so I'll look into that and get back to Cindy on that one, since she's my client. But right now the thought is, oh, well, the project number shouldn't have to be required if it's just overhead. But there may be an option. I'll look at our transaction preference list. Okay, so we just entered some more transactions against our project. So if I went and looked at it again, it's going to have those increased transactions there. And I just love the transaction screen because there's so many ways you can filter it and look at everything. And if you're a project manager, you want to keep on top of, well, have these transactions been billed? If there's not a little box next to them, then that means they've been billed on an invoice. That's why you can't select them again. So like this particular one, there's only one on this one, has been billed, so there's no box next to it. It's always kind of good to understand, what you're looking at and what you're doing here. You can also transfer from this page or write off, but we're not going to cover that today. Other than obviously, if you're going to have accurate P&Ls, you do sometimes even with our best efforts, end up with something on this transaction page that as the project manager, you're like, oh, this really should have gone to another project. So we're not going to cover how to do it, just the fact that you can do it. If you do need to transfer, no problem. It'll give a negative on this particular project, and then whichever project you're transferring to, it'll accurately update and show there. Sometimes people will even transfer transactions if they, aren't marking the transactions as billed after they've been billed. So this is a good time to talk about, since we're in the project, that when you're on the schedule screen, there is a feature. Oh, sorry, not this one. I'm not telling you the truth. There it is, refresh project financials. So on this main screen here, it says when you hover over it, occasionally a project may not roll up the data completely accurately. That's usually because we've entered something and then we've gone back and changed it. And so we just want to make sure, did that change really go through? So really anytime, and you can do this unlimited number of times on the project, you can hit refresh project financials. If anything looks a little wonky, or if you know, oh, hey, I transferred something here, I just want to make sure that everything is accurately showing. And maybe you even ran the client or project P&L and you see something that, oh, that doesn't look right. Sometimes we give someone a raise, or we somehow change, or even more commonly than the raise scenario is, folks will, after a call like this, say, you know what, we really are ready to go ahead and put our employee costs in the employee record. And so it was zero, because I hadn't entered it originally. And now I've entered it and I'm running the report and it still says zero. You may need to refresh your project financials on that, because at the time it was entered, it was zero. But now if you hit refresh, it goes out and looks at the employee record, and whatever's in there at that, at the time it looks at it, it recalculates it. So that's a handy thing to know about that refresh project financials. And since we're talking about the employee record and where you would enter those costs, if we navigate to that, and that's under admin manager employees, and I'm just going to go into a random one here that I have at the top. And once that opens, there we go. And then under accounting, this is where we really want you to put that loaded employee cost. So most people do not have a billable rate in here, and that's because the rate is coming from the service. So, if I'm doing copywriting, I'm billing at one rate. If I'm doing proofreading, that might be at another rate. So that really allows a smaller agency to have somebody wear different hats. And basically, we're not saying, well, this individual, this Jim Halpert guy, he doesn't always bill at the same rate. It's based on his services. That's the most common. So even though that's right there in the front and looks like you should populate it, most of you should have that at zero. And if you have a question about whether that should be populated or not, say yours is populated and you just want to know, how is this affecting anything, you can get with your account manager. But really, unless you also set the projects up to look at the employee record to pull the billable rate, then if you had something in there, it's kind of a no harm, no foul, but you really don't need it in there because you'd have to be charging by person in order for that to be relevant. However, the second one, the one that's blue and has a blinking cursor there, that's the hourly cost. And that is where you're going to put, and we recommend a loaded. So if you're paying the employees health insurance costs or 401k match or whatever that employee is costing you per hour. You might say, well, they're not hourly employees, they're salaried. That doesn't matter. We want you to come up with an hourly calculation. And then you might say, well, no, wait a minute. Why do I need hourly and monthly? And that's because certain reports pull from the monthly column and other reports pull from the hourly. So most people, we're just looking for a roundabout number there. So they'll use a 2,080 hour work year, even if, folks maybe have accrued enough vacation that they're not working a full 2,080 hours. They kind of try to be consistent. So they'll say, based on a 2,080 hour work year, their salaried employee, let me divide that by 2,080 to come up with an hourly cost. And then for monthly cost, you're just going to do the same thing. If you're a salaried employee, divide it by 12. So definitely populate both of those. The hourly cost has an update option on it. So I was talking earlier about, well, if you started out with this being blank, like it is for this particular user, then you probably want to do update and put a start date that's in the past. We didn't used to have an update here. So when somebody got a raise, for instance, the person who was in the accounting role had to come in here and update this hourly cost for the day they wanted it to become active. But now that we have the little blue update option, you can set control. So no matter when you actually are physically populating that field, that you can set a start date and even an end date. But usually people are putting in only a start date for when that rate should become effective. So All right, that will make you have an accurate cost for that employee. Now, of course, the amount that we bill for them is based on their service, as we said, usually, and for 99% of the cases. So that is going to be your basically your cost, but even though the field is labeled hourly cost, it's what the employee costs you. So don't take into consider anything for what we're charging the client in that case. You're just talking about what you are paying for that employee. Okay, so now let us go to those reports that I have listed under my favorite. Oh, before I do that though, I see a couple more questions. So let's look at that. So someone says, is there an effective date per hour for employees, or does the record change for all historical data too? Tina probably asked that question right before I answered it. So yes, that's what that update allows for. So great question, a very timely question. Yeah, you can say and it will change historically for whatever date range you enter in there. So to answer Tina's question. And then Cindy says, can you show us the way to hide hourly monthly costs so no one can see it if they aren't supposed to? It's so important, Cindy. It's such a great question. And so it's actually, it's so important actually that there is a whole entire web page on it in our help guide. So I'm going to see, I don't know if I can chat, but I'm going to try to add this as a link in the chat and see if that works. Somebody will have to let me know whether it came through or not, because I know another user said that they weren't able to chat. So let me know if somebody wants to respond. Cindy's so great at responding. If you don't mind, Cindy, if you see in the chat that link to this frequently asked question, which is how to hide employees' hourly costs. Oh, awesome. Okay. No, she does not see it. Okay, so what that is not an option to chat. And I know somebody said that earlier that they weren't able, I think Jennifer said she couldn't chat earlier. So definitely it's very easy to find in the help guide. Even if you just start typing how to hide, that's all you have to put and it'll pop up. So, and even if I were to close this one, I'll show you guys that really quick. So if I said, oh, I'm going to the help guide, let me see, how do I hide those labor costs? Because it's kind of complicated. It's more than one place. So it's not like one checkbox where you can say, oh, hide it everywhere. You have to go to these different areas. So uncheck view labor net cost lookups and reports. So that's a security setting. In the security group options tab for custom reports, you need to say do not allow for all these detail data sets. So if the person has the rights to create custom reports, this would come into play, right? Because if they could create a custom report using the time detail data set, LaborNet is going to be on there. So if they can find a time entry that's 1 hour for another coworker, they'd be able to see what they make. So you're basically being told you need to not be able to give them rights to these reports. Now, that's rights for them to create the custom report. If you've created the custom report, you can give them individual access to that. And of course, you wouldn't include the column for LaborNet. And then it talks about, by default, no security starts out with customer report data sets. So it's very possible that you go in there and they don't have any data sets. And that's very common for a lot of users. And then it talks about, if you give them access to the project dashboard, it is going to show actual profit and labor net. No details are available, but what if only one person has put time to the project at the time they look at it? Well, then they can see it. So basically, this just tells you all the different areas that you can and can give access to. This is actually very important. I think they should put no in bolded and both uppercase, because project budget analysis is no net visible, and that is such an important report for project managers to be running. So it's beyond the just sub saying the profit. It tells you all the details, not just the profit and loss. So now, since we have, and I want to pause again because it looks like we got some questions from that one. You can assign COGS. Oh, you can make project numbers. Sorry, I'm behind on these questions. Can you show way to hide? chat is disabled. Somebody said, yep, not working. And then Zoom chat is disabled, but the Q&A feature is enabled. So yeah, I don't know. I don't actually set this up, so I don't know what kind of backend things are running for Zoom. So I apologize that I couldn't send this link, but you can easily find it. And you should be in the help guide after this call anyway, because I would also look for the project profit and loss multi-guide, the client profit and loss multi-guide, the multi is saying that you can run it for more than one client at the same time, but there's also a client profit and loss that's individual and a project profit and loss that's for an individual project. And we're going to look at those in just about 5 seconds here. But I would pull this up and kind of review it, because it'll probably, if you're using an example and kind of trying to compare it, it'll probably bring up more questions. And then of course you can get with your account manager and look at yours individually and say, okay, why this? And it's always nice to pick like one project you're familiar with and kind of map that back and say, okay, this is pulling from here, this is pulling from here. And we'll be able to do that a little bit today with our example project, and I'll show you that next. So I'm going to navigate back to the main menu. And then I'm going to go to everyone, which is where the report center is located. And I'm going to click on report center. And then I made the reports that we're covering today my quote unquote favorites. And that's super simple to do. They're all actually located in the financial reports section. So if you find client profit and loss detail view, you would just click the star and that would make it a favorite for you. So you might say, well, I don't have anything labeled favorites. You won't see favorites until you have a favorite. So until you try it and say, I'm going to make something a favorite, you won't have a category that's named favorites, but it'll automatically create that category for you if you make something a favorite. So that I kind of just did that to make it easy for us to see in one place everything that we want to cover today. So I'm going to click on profit. We're going to start with the project profit and loss multi-view. This is probably the most common, so I like to start with the most commonly run. And then we're not going to talk about allocating overhead at all today. The call was about how do we enter transactions so they accurately show up on this report. So we're going to set that to none. And then I'm going to set mine for all time. That's probably a mistake if you've been in the system for a long time and you have a lot of data in there, but this is my test account. There's not a lot in here, and I'm actually going to only do it for this one client. I think there's only like 3 projects in here for this client. So I'm going to pick the client that I want to run it for. Now, a lot of people have custom layouts in here. So they say, well, I need to see different columns than my coworker. And so you might have project profitability by project for Marlene or for Cindy. And so she might want to see different things. So I'll show you how you would make another one of those, but it's going to default to just the one, that's already preloaded in your system. And then you might also want to say, well, I'm kind of looking for project profitability for a particular project type. So you could enter the project type or a combination of project types. So you could say, oh, just events and direct mail, whatever you want to choose. I'm not going to choose that because I cannot remember what all the different projects types are in here. I want to show you the most data. So I'm going to leave that unselected. You could also pick something in a particular status. If you pick the different date ranges, it's only going to look at transactions that fall within that date range. So, those transactions I just did, since we've been on our call, they would show if I said today or, if I said everything this week. But I have a lot of old transactions in there too. So I want to do all, but usually you're not picking all. That usually is running way too much data and you'll have to wait a while when you do that. A lot of people like to look at this for just their own projects. So we do have project manager and account manager as filters. If you don't see project manager on your project, contact your support at workamajig.com and let them know you'd like that turned on. If you've been a client of ours for quite a while, we did not used to have 2 separate fields, one for project manager and one for account manager. We just kind of use the account manager as a overall umbrella to say anybody who's in charge of this project, but we have since broken that out at the request of many clients. So that's something you just have to turn on. It's in your transaction preferences. You probably could find it on your own, but if not, your account manager will tell you exactly where it is. Once you have to have access to the back end. So it's admin, system setup, and then transaction preferences. And then there's something that says use project manager. And then what that will do is open that field. I'm going to stay here, but I'm going to navigate to the project just really quick to show you that I have a project manager field. So under project settings, it'll add another field, project manager. And those could be different people. In fact, you probably, if they weren't going to be different people, there would be no reason for them to be separated out. So definitely, if that's something you want to look more into, we can do some training, do more explaining on that. But I did want to point that out because people used to ask for that frequently, and we didn't always have it. So and then the other thing here is you can get into Google Financial links. So you could send this to Google Financials and massage it, do more with it. We are absolutely not training on that today. That's a whole training in itself. And actually, I think there is a webinar that already exists on Google Financials. So you can search for that in the webinar section. If you just do Google Financial webinar in the help guide, it'll come up and you can watch that one if you'd like to. And then everything else in here is really talking about overhead, and we're not going to talk about overhead today. We're really just talking about what if I ran just the raw numbers without applying overhead. And, I'm using this test account, test site. It doesn't have everything set up properly for overhead, so it wouldn't be a really great example. So we've got none selected here. And we're going to run the report. And it'll take just a little while because it's looking through 13 years worth of data to pull this up. That's how long I've had this test account. And so it takes a little while. And then we're just showing that one particular client, and there's all the projects that I have for that client. And you might say, well, I have a lot more options than you're showing right here, Marlene, for mine. And that is true if you have customized your view. And so you can customize it. And I talked about how you could have separate options, like one for Cindy, one for me. And to do that, you would hit modify. And then you were going to say, copy this view. So, oh, and the nice thing, this is new, restore defaults. So if you ever said, oh, I've kind of picked a bunch of things here, and now, gosh, I don't really know if I like all those. I kind of want it back to how it defaults straight from the factory, straight from Workamajig. You can say restore defaults, and it'll put those columns in there. So, you could do copy this view. Yes, I'm sure I want to copy it. And then you could say on the copied view, restore the defaults. And then you have to always memorize. If you forget to memorize and you just navigate away from here, it won't be here anymore. But you can see this is the copy, and this has a lot more options. And I could, of course, add additional columns as well, depending on all that you need to see. But I'm going to close out of this just to show you that now there's two. And I could name this something else. Like I said, it could be for Cindy or whatever. So if I run that again, and I hit modify, that's in the settings section, which will come up in a minute, where you can change the name of the report. So you can have 15 different project profit and loss options in here, and each person could have it filtered for them as an account manager. So they're not always having to pick me as an account manager. This one in particular is private. It defaults to private. So if I wanted other people to be able to see it as an option to select, I could add different security groups in there, and then other people will be able to see it. And it's always going to default to private. So you always have to remember to come in here and remove that privacy feature if you're sharing it with others. If it is only for you, well, then there you go. So I could say Cindy's. I hope you don't mind that I keep using you as an example, Cindy. Cindy's profitability by project and multi. So I'm going to hit apply again. I'm going to hit memorize again. And then now you're going to see if I navigate out of here, and I'm not going to do it again because I don't want you to have to wait for this to run again, but you'd be able to see the different column headers. So the nice thing about this particular report, and you're going to see, we're going to run the client P&L here in just a minute too, but you're going to see that you can drill down into these items. So if you said, well, I want to know what comprises this $100 in labor, I can click, or it's 100 hours, not $100. Sorry, it's $10,000 because it's 100 hours at $100 an hour. You can see that. And this happens to just be one time entry. So it's kind of a big one, but you can see all those details. And that's the nice thing about the multi-view. It has the drill downs on it. So I'm going to pause just for a minute because we have a few more questions. And someone says, can you use a blended employee hourly rate instead of the actual employee hour rate to reduce the risk of rate exposure? Absolutely, Melody. Great question. A lot of people do that. It works for the larger agencies. Where it falls down sometimes is if you have a smaller agency and if you only have two people doing copywriting, for instance, and then if you don't set the settings to lower the exposure of people being able to find labor net, Well, if they're the creative, or they're the other copywriter running it, and the amount is any amount higher than what they know they make, I mean, there's just a lot of things to consider there. But you are totally right that you could use a blended. A lot of people do, in fact, use a blended, just because they're looking for like a roundabout figure there. They're not looking for down to the penny, because again, we're using like a 2,080-hour work year. We're not using the exact number of hours they worked that year, that kind of thing. So that's a great suggestion, Melody. Okay, so back to looking at the report. I could jump to the project from here. Really, anything that's underlined is letting you know you could jump to that and see where that information is coming from. Of course, the budget, that's going to come from your approved estimate. Revenue, that's going to come from your billing. And this, I made a really quick invoice before the call started, so there'd be something in that column. But I also left it backdated for the date that it was created, which is in 2022. So you can see that that's what was billed. Now, did I bill the actual transactions? I did not. I just billed $100. So really, it's just showing what was billed. If you build the actual transactions on an invoice, you'd be able to drill down into that further and see the transactions that were already billed. The thing I love about this report too is almost everything has an explanation of, well, what is revenue? What does Workamajig consider COGS? Or, how do we come up with AGI? Well, it's revenue minus COGS. So it's really nice to be able to do that. And people don't know it sometimes until they hover over it. But this tells you revenue, that's going to be all invoices that uses the project on the invoice, which back to our main reason for this call is make sure everything's accurate. If you just create an invoice out of the blue, which you can do in Workamajig, but you don't tie it to at least the project, well, when you run the client P&L, it'll be right. But when you run the project P&L, you won't get as great of a picture. So that's why we always say bill the transactions if you're billing time and materials. If you're billing fixed fee, that's fine too. But just make sure that you're getting that project number on the line, because that's what's going to pull into these fields. All right, so I'm not going to cover all these, and I'm sure there's people that were really hoping that we would. That is going to be another call that's coming, I think, April. But right now we're just talking about getting the data entered so that this is accurate, because that's step one, get it accurate. And then I just want to show you this, that this now says Cindy's because we changed that. So nice to be able to have different ones. Sometimes people don't want to see closed, or they do want to see closed. This is doing all for whatever date range I selected, and that's the default. But that's something to watch. If somebody has come in here and said only closed projects, troubleshooting on this page is usually linked to what people have filtered. So if you ever, don't waste too much time being, confused, why is this not what I think it should be? Shoot us an email at support@workamajig.com. Show us a screenshot of what you're using for your filters, and then we can always troubleshoot and say, this one isn't on here because it's closed, or whatever the case may be. In fact, I know that when we were kind of talking about, well, let's make sure we present all the pitfalls when we do this webinar, one of the things that's a big pitfall is whether or not the project is closed or not. So if you want to show both closed and open, we have that. You just need to make sure that's set to all. Another thing too, if you've closed projects and in the meantime, you've made a lot of changes after this call, I've gone in and I've done the labor net, and I've set, you probably want to do that refresh project financials we talked about. It's because, if it was already closed, you'll just have to refresh it. It'll retroactively refresh it though, and it'll apply the labor net if you've just entered that recently. So that's the good news. All right, I am going to close out of that one, and then we're going to do the detail view. I'm kind of working from the back up here. And so this gives you options to run comparative information, because this is just going to show your general ledger. So I'm going to change this to all again, because I want to be able to show more data. And then you could do a comparative, but if you do a comparative, then you have to say, well, what are you comparing? Last fiscal year to date to this fiscal year to date? Okay, we could do that. I want to leave it single range because I don't have enough data in here to probably make this terribly meaningful. So I'll say single range, but you also can do just one single project here, or if you have single campaigns, but multiple projects, or multiple campaigns. Now, I'm just going to do the one that we've been working with, which is that APS project. So let me pull that one up. And then if I said multiple campaigns, then of course it's going to say, well, which campaigns? So there's a lot more to fill out if you select the different options down here. A lot of you probably don't have separate general ledger companies, so you don't need to worry about that. And again, we're not talking about overhead, so we're going to leave it at none. And then you have a few little options here to show summary account totals. That's if you have roll-up general ledger accounts, or subtract costs before allocation. So a couple of options there. And then this talks again about all the different allocations. We're not going to cover this, but it talks about the 3 different types of expenses in Workamajig. There's really 5 different types, but some of them are subtypes. COGS, expenses, and other expenses is what we're talking about when we say the expenses in Workamajig. And then there is a report that you can run, and it's really great. It's the overhead allocation details. Again, we're not going to cover that in this call because we only have an hour, but definitely look into this. This is great information. And if you want to work with your account manager individually with an example, and they can train you one-on-one on that. And then let's talk about, since we don't have too much time left, only 5 minutes, let's talk about the client P&L multi-view. So same thing, I'm going to say none, I'm going to say all, just because mine doesn't have a lot. Same thing here where you could have more than one view if you needed to. And then I'm going to add that same, this is going to be for all, so you don't even have to filter by client. In fact, it won't let you filter by client. So we're just going to hit run, and it's going to show all of my clients for the date range that I selected. So you still have that flexibility. You know, if you have 15 years or 20 years worth of work in Workamajig and you don't want to run all of that, you could say just for the last 2 years or just for this year, whatever you need. And this one, again, has drill downs on it, which I love. So kind of going back to this one that we were working on, you could say, well, what's that revenue? What's that comprised of? If you drill into this, it's going to show you all the different invoices, and you can go trace back, look at those, make sure they were done correctly. You also can say, oh, I have this invoice, you know, and I don't think I connected it to a project. You can do some research on that and do some troubleshooting and say, oh, you're right, it's not in here. So I may need to go back and change my invoice so that it has that project number, and then it flows through properly to here. So that's really the point of this call, is we'd like to catch that stuff before we're trying to make changes, you know, before you have to notice it when running the report, but definitely, you know, goes a long way to make sure that you're always picking that project. All right, I'm going to close out of this one, and then we'll do the last but not least, the client profit and loss detail. We're going to do all again. And then you can create budgets for your clients in Workamajig. We are not going to train on or talk about that right now, but just know that there's directions to do it in the help guide if you search for budgeting. Then that's why if you pick budget comparative summary, I have budgets in here. I have one lonely budget, but you could have different budgets. You have to just pre-create those before you run. It's not going to know that what you want the budget to be until you load that into Workamajig. So definitely, if you want more information on that, let us know. And we're going to do our client as APS. And then I'm just going to run it based on revenue. We're going to say run the report. And then you can see that I can drill down. So I'm looking at my general ledger, and I could say, well, let me see what the lodging expense was. What particularly was that? Oh, I see it was a vendor invoice and they stayed here. You know, if you had details like you can actually change the columns that appear here. So if you need more details, let us know. We can help with that. But essentially, you're just running your report, and then you're being able to drill down and see, well, what percentage of, you know, media is this particular client? Oh, it's 84%. So that's a pretty big amount. So lots of details in here, and we don't cover in this call everything about these reports. That would definitely be something you could find out from your account manager, that you could run those together. Okay, I'm going to pause for the last few questions that we might have in here. Maybe we got them all. I know Melody answered or asked the last one, so maybe that was it. But hopefully you get a good baseline with this call, and then this will open up lots of other questions about reporting and training options that you can work with your account manager to discover. And then I think in April, I think I said this at the beginning of the call too, that we're going to have something that is a little more deeper dive into the financials, like overhead allocation. That's more of an accounting call. So it's kind of a different audience, although a lot of you wear different hats. So you're in the accounting piece like Cindy, and you're in the other, day-to-day, PM piece. You're looking at that kind of thing too. So this is more, focused on the PM and that they're getting the data in there accurately. And then the next call would be that the accounting person is analyzing the data that's been accurately entered. So. All right, guys, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for attending, and we definitely will see you at the next webinar.